can you introduce yourself and give us a little 25 words or less snapshot of your, I don't know, your work? I didn't mean 25 words. You could use more than 25 words, but yeah, it's a little snapshot of your interests in your work and what you would like to share here today.
Yes, my name is Mike Macy, and I'm a writer and therapeutic body worker. I grew up in New Jersey, and as a 16-year-old went to Olympic National Park with the Student Conservation Association to do work in the backcountry for a 3-week spell, and fell in love with the Olympics immediately. Went back the next summer, and the following summer, when I turned 18, I got a seasonal job with the Park Service and was a backcountry ranger in the Olympics for the next 7 years. So until through the summer of 1975, and worked. Didn't work in the Elwha, but I hiked there a fair amount. I worked over the ridge mostly on the Hull, which is sort of premium Olympic rainforest on the west side. And then I moved to Alaska, where I did all kinds of different jobs. Went back to graduate school, got a master's in English literature, and have been living in Alaska ever since until 2018 when we moved to Oregon.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that I wanted to explore, since we're working with this group of colleagues in New York with City University of New York and so forth, I'm very interested in the topics that Howard has brought to the table and some of my background and so forth. So those topics are both Alaska and the Elwha watershed and environment. Mm-hmm. And as a result of my making the film on the Elwha, which is called Unconquering the Last Frontier, I had a lot of clips, with native elders and with historians, and kind of gave them an introduction to that. So we're organizing a conference, which is tentatively called the Elwha Legacy Conference, which really comes into being by saying, now this work has taken place on the Elwha. It has not taken place anywhere else. So we had and have a restoration program, a dam removal program, and all that goes along with that. And that hasn't happened, except with the exception of a few locations.
Right.
So we're on new territory there as far as letting nature do what nature does, and at least stepping out of the way of the last 100 years of intervention, interference, and all that. And at the same time, we're looking at Alaska and climate change there, the warming of the temperatures, the impacts. That's the reason for Howard's work, with the leaking tanks. The tribe is having difficulty maintaining hunting access and fishing access and economic stability and so forth, and they may even have to move the village. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about all of this in the sense of humans, warming, ice, and I see a kind of rough parallel, but Olympic, it's pretty fragile, being temperate rainforest,
Right.
It's not a heavily glaciated environment that, like Rainier or something like that, but right. Vulnerable to the same changes. So in Alaska, you have these, the villages have, and it's not just Quinnahock that we're studying. I mean, it's a bunch of villages.
Right, right.
Look at that map. All those villages around that whole Bering Sea area, south and north of Quinnahock are all vulnerable to being.
The whole YK Delta. And in a way, it probably extends right clear across the top of Canada. I mentioned, or maybe Howard mentioned, that my wife and I have been spending a fair amount of time in the summers recently rafting on the Upper Yukon, and just seeing whole riverbanks that were permafrost thawing and collapsing right into the river. And we're talking, I don't know, in terms of volume, just huge hillsides collapsing. And then the other thing, of course, that you see is miles and miles and miles of recently burned over land, because the fires, it's hotter, drier, and in the summer, and the forest all the way across into the boreal forest is just going up in smoke, and everywhere you look.
What are the impacts that you see there that go along with it? Can you kind of put that in context?
Well,
like, are there people up there? Are there villages up there? Or
there are villages up there. I would imagine, so up there and in the interior, you're talking about caribou's and probably the main protein, and salmon. So I worked on climate change with Alaska Conservation Foundation for a couple of years, and we actually had a conference, one day sort of symposium in Washington, D.C. for congressional staffers, and we brought a guy from Shishmaref to talk about what's happening there, and we brought a salmon, actually a bird biologist, fantastic guy, George DeVoke from Seattle, who had been studying black guillemots off on the barrier islands off Barrow, and they somehow, someone had during World War II had left some structures up there that they were able to colonize. But they're very sensitive. Their nesting season is very short, and everything has to go right for them to have success. The other guy that we had there was a fisheries biologist from University of Washington, who was doing work on the Yukon River and documenting warming in the water. And at just, where the Yukon River was, water temperatures were hitting 60 degrees, temperatures that are too hot for salmon to spawn. And on some of those upper Yukon tributaries, you're seeing Chinook salmon that have come up, something like 1,200 miles to spawn. And, they don't have a second chance. Conditions have to be right, or,
wow,
they're not going to make it. And all those villages, the salmon are so important for food and for dog food, for their huskies and stuff, and for a certain amount of revenue. The Yukon, for quite a while, had a fisher. Those fish would be sold in Anchorage and other places, the big king salmon and stuff. So, a lot of impacts, and
so economic impacts as well. You're kind of
yeah, and we talked on the phone about Richard K. Nelson, and the spiritual, cultural survival of those people is all tied into what's going on the land and their relationship with the fish and animals and trees and stuff. So, we have economic in our culture. Oh, everything's there's economic impacts here, climate here, fish. It's everything's sort of separate, but in a traditional community, it's very, very. It's all one. And anyway.
And is that different than Port Angeles, let's say, or a southern, more civilized road? We have roads, right? So
Yeah.
What are the differences and what are the similarities in light of?
what early on, I don't know, 1992 or something, I did a canoe trip off there's a road that goes from basically Dawson, Yukon to the Mackenzie River Delta in the Northwest Territories. And it cuts through the wintering ground of the porcupine caribou herd, which which makes this incredible migration every spring to calve on the Arctic coastal plain of Alaska, just east of Prudhoe Bay. And there's been a big political fight over the calving grounds for years because some people think there's a lot of oil under them. And anyway, so we canoed down from down the Eagle to the Bell to the Porcupine River into Old Crow, which is a very traditional Athabascan Gwich'in village in the middle of nowhere on northern Yukon. And their whole life revolves around those caribou coming back every year. And the caribou were, this was early September, the caribou were starting to thread back into the country from their summer on the North Slope. And folks were out upriver getting firewood and hunting caribou, so you could float the firewood down the river and take the caribou meat back down to the town. And everywhere we went, people waved us over. We in a canoe, waved us over to the bank and offered us, they'd have some caribou ribs steaming in a pot or something, and they would offer us food. And when we got to Old Crow, the first thing we did was ask the first person we met. We asked the village, where could we find the village chief so we could get permission to camp in town. And it was a young woman, and she said, "Oh, forget that. I'm living at my mom's. You could just have our house." And for a couple of days, because the plane doesn't fly every day back to Dawson. And so just that kind of generosity, there's rifles and all kinds of, her 308 caribou rifle in there. And then we heard a story about one of the elders had just died. And I don't know, a week or two before, he had been in his 90s. And sometime a day or two after the funeral, villagers were awoken because a huge caribou bull was walking right through the village. And they just said, well, that's his spirit. I haven't spent much time with the natives, the Clallam people or the Elwha people, so I don't know whether there's stories like that there. But in Old Crow, very, very traditional, close to the land, 300 miles from the nearest road. And the river is the road in the summer and the winter. It's not so good when it's freeze up or break up, but that was a once in a lifetime experience. Because there's been a lot of change in places like that with, people watching TVs and being increasingly acculturated with modern technology and stuff.
Do they have the internet?
I bet they do. Probably, I know in northern Alaska, one of the main telephone providers in Alaska was very good politically at getting federal money, and they got a huge amount of federal money to put internet into high-speed internet into all these tiny villages in northern Alaska. And I don't know whether that's still going on, but they got a bunch of the infrastructure installed in a bunch of villages on the North Slope. And I know who to ask about that. But and of course, places like Barrow are probably, they probably have fiber optics to Barrow and all kinds of stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Have you written about your experiences on the Yukon?
No. The experience I've written about in the Yukon was almost freezing to death on a solo ski trip in 1979, and it turned out it was a vision quest. I didn't realize it at the time. But I did get the vision. It took me 15 years to remember the vision, but I'd been to a couple Sundances with some friends down, one in McDermott, Nevada, and I'd asked for a vision at the Sundance, and when it didn't come while I had my hands on the cottonwood tree in the center of the Sundance, I kind of quickly forgot about it. But 5 months later, right between the eyes, and so I've written about that. But it's a good question, and I may write about some that, I mean, up north it's, and others have written about it. Up north it's sort of like, well, what else is new? I mean, the place is melting and burning up, and in fact, I think, getting back to the Elwha, we're going to start to see much bigger fires on the Olympic Peninsula, including in the headwaters of the Elwha. And I think a restored natural system is going to be able to withstand that better than one where there's a dam, a bunch of dams. And there were, early on, way before my time, there were two huge fires on the west side of the peninsula, starting about 20 miles west of the Elwha, that went almost clear to forks, like 30 or 40 miles in hours. They were started, one of them was started by sparks from a logging train. Mm-hmm. And, just in a hot, dry period, and they had an east wind, and the thing just, and this is, big timber, just went whoosh. And so I don't know when that was, maybe 1910 or something. And then there was another one in the 1950s. And there used to be a big sign on the highway talking about the Forks fire or whatever. I didn't see it when I went by the other day. But
mm-hmm. Well, one of the interesting things about the Olympics is a sense of scale that's a bit different, than mm-hmm. many areas of the country. And so we can look at just the growth of things, trees, for example, how large they really were.
Right.
And, continue to be in certain areas where there's old growth. And so I can't imagine what a fire through that material would be like back in 1910.
Well, I can't swear that it was all old growth back then. That was, so the story of the Olympics is that it was sort of nibbling around the edges where the white loggers, homesteaders, pioneers kind of started towards the heart of the peninsula from the coast and logged their way and stump wrenched their way inland. And, I think in some cases, unless you get a crown fire, which is hard, if you have a really big old growth, those trees are probably mostly going to get burned around their ankles and calves, and they may survive. I'm not a fire expert or ecologist, but I know there are other places where fire is just part of the natural mm-hmm. scheme of things, and it's like Doug firs. They're fire tolerant, and the fires go through the undergrowth. And the big problem, as I understand it, is that we've had 100 years of fire suppression in the West, and so the undergrowth has gotten big enough, tall enough that it's getting it's able to conduct flames up into the canopy, and then you have crown fires. But anyway.
So isn't it kind of strange? I mean, I think I'm roughly your age, and I think, isn't this odd? It's like growing up in a Isaac Asimov book or something, or a science fiction piece, where, and I think even the Outer Limits television show had an episode where people were in a New York apartment and the temperature was heating up, and they were sweltering and sweating, and were turning, and you'd see the shot of the sun out the window getting hotter and hotter, and so I remember thinking in my sci-fi experience of being about 14 years old that it would be odd to be the last survivor, of a nuclear war or a catastrophe or this or that, and I have this feeling in a way that we maybe our generation may have been the last generation of not needing to be fighting so hard for survival or worried so much about the impacts of climate, for example.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when I was growing up, we didn't think about any of this stuff, but there were people studying, living up the Ho, working up the Ho. I met glaciologists that were working on Mount Olympus, and some of them became friends. I read their papers, and I actually worked for some briefly as a field assistant up in Alaska on the variegated glacier by Yakutat, and I spent a fair amount of time. One of my favorite parts of Alaska is the Gulf Coast, basically from just north of Sitka all the way to Prince William Sound, which is outside the polar regions, and Greenland is the most heavily glaciated part of the planet, and these huge ice fields that go for hundreds of miles, going up from the coast up into the St. Elias Mountains and down the other side almost to the Alcan, and and they're all, I think there's only one glacier in Alaska, I don't know which one it is, that's actually expanding, and the other 10,000 are in serious retreat. So that has huge implications for sea level and for fisheries and water supply. It's kind of, you like to think this is a phase that they're going through. One of the things they're finding is that there's starting to be this phenomenal landslides in the Fairweather Range and the St. Elias Range, because the glaciers, when they carve out a valley, they oversteepen the slopes. There's kind of a U-shaped profile with almost vertical walls and then a flat bottom, as opposed to a river valley that's V-shaped.
Uh-huh.
So when you take the ice out, you have all this rock that's up there, and if it's been faulted or had a lot of freeze thaw happening, you can have these landslides that go 5-6 miles, drop, the mountainside will collapse way up near the summit and come all the way shooting down across glaciers, burying glaciers in 300 or 400 feet of material, and they're predicting that there's going to be a lot more of that. You have a place like Juneau, which is the capital of Alaska, and it's sitting right on the edge of a fjord, and it's always been famous for being at risk of big avalanches. But there's a place on the west side of the Olympics, out on the coast, where I think somewhere near Lake Ozette, where a little camp or village of natives was buried, hundreds or 1,000 years ago by something, just a slope collapsing. And so we'll see what kind of, there's a risk to communities like probably Haines, Skagway, Juneau for sure. Any place that's at the head of a fjord. Yeah.
Well, Juneau is the capital of the state of Alaska.
Right. Well, some would argue that, well, of course, there's always been a move, like, as there is in every state, to move the capital to where we live and take it out of where someone else lives. But Juneau's, has no road access to the North American highway system. So you either fly in there or you ride by boat. And you used to have really good ferry service, but the economy's gone to hell in Alaska, and the political power is not in Southeast Alaska. So the ferry system is really, they basically had no ferry system last winter, and in Southeast Alaska, once a week, once a month service. All the ferries are like 50, 60 years old, and they all have mechanical problems, and then they don't, they're always trying to upgrade them to meet current Coast Guard standards, and costs tens, 20s, hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. So,
So we're getting a little more disconnected.
Oh yeah.
As well. So we're not only talking about, how do we get the sled over the ice, when the ice is melting, or how do we hunt a seal when our sea ice barrier is done? But now we have like ferries not supplying major cities properly.
Right.
And in addition to large scale earth movements and landslides in and around glaciers and at the top of fjords. So this is something that people don't really realize, I don't think, in the lower 48, we're not exposed.
So one of my very first experiences in the Olympic, the park has this very narrow wilderness coastal strip, and with a hiking trail along it, and you have to go over headlands, and it's the headlands are dangerous, and so we're working at the mouth of a creek, and really a small creek that you could wade across between each pool anywhere you wanted. And so after work one day, I left the beach and the fellow students and started walking up this creek, and I don't know, I went maybe a quarter mile, and it was just that primordial Northwest sort of jungle that you see ads for Visit Oregon or something, it's just like, and suddenly a bald eagle or two flew up from the ground, right, maybe 50 feet ahead of me, and I got to where they'd been, and there's a beautiful 36-inch salmon spine on the ground. They've been feeding on a dead salmon or steelhead, I'm not sure which. And this is, I'm just a New Jersey kid I grew up in the New Jersey countryside, fishing for little native brook trout like this big and this big. And, my eyes are like wide open. So I go a little further, and there's a big pool there, and there's two river otters, and they're scared by me. They're scared about me, and they're diving and then coming up and breeding. And there are two big spawning salmon in this pool. So, between the eagles and the crows and the ravens and the river otter, and then these two huge spawning fish that were as big as anything I'd ever seen in Field and Stream, which I used to read. I just had this felt sense that I had come to a place that was exactly the way it was supposed to be.